Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. It was late November 2018. When the Tennessee mountains begin their slow surrender to winter. The dampness in the air carried that distinct smell of decaying leaves and wet soil, while the temperature hovered just low enough to make you grateful for a good jacket. I remember the date precisely because it marked the beginning of what I now call my sleepless season. My name is John, and I've lived in these mountains most of my life. Our house, a weathered two-story wooden structure that's been in the family for generations, sits nestled among tall pines about 15 miles from the nearest town. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. My mother worked double shifts at the regional hospital, meaning I often had the place to myself for days at a time. The nearest neighbors lived about half a mile down the winding dirt road. An elderly couple who kept to themselves, save for the occasional courtesy wave. On that particular Tuesday evening, I was sorting through bills at the kitchen table when my phone vibrated against the wooden surface. Joe's name flashed across the screen. We'd been friends since middle school, bonded by our mutual interest in video games and an appreciation for solitude that most of our peers couldn't understand. "Mike, I need to get out of the city," were his first words when I answered. The background noise suggested he was at his apartment downtown. Cars honking, neighbors arguing through thin walls. "This place is suffocating me. Mind if I come up for a few days?" "You know you're always welcome," I replied, glancing at the calendar. Mom was on a 3-day shift rotation, which meant the house would be empty except for us. "When were you thinking?" "Today?" The desperation in his voice was palpable. Something about his tone suggested more than the usual city fatigue. "I can be ready in an hour." I agreed without hesitation. Joe had always been there for me, and besides, I welcomed the company. The house felt different lately, larger somehow, with shadows that seemed to linger in corners longer than they should. "I'll drive down and get you," I offered, already reaching for my keys. "It'll be dark by the time we get back, but we can stop for supplies on the way." As I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that Joe's visit would be different this time. The mountains had secrets, whispers that traveled through the trees. But I dismissed these thoughts as I locked the front door behind me. The ancient porch steps creaked beneath my weight, a sound I'd heard thousands of times. Yet today, it resonated with an unfamiliar hollowness. Little did I know that within 24 hours, that familiar sound would become a warning. The drive into the city passed quickly. Traffic was light, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway. When I arrived at Joe's apartment complex, he was already waiting outside, a duffel bag at his feet and a backpack slung over one shoulder. His face brightened when he saw my truck pull up. "You look terrible," I observed, as he threw his bags into the back seat. Joe ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Haven't been sleeping well. The neighbors have been loud." He hesitated, as if deciding whether to elaborate. "Thanks for this, Mike. I really needed to get away." We spent the next couple of hours in the city, stopping first at a gaming store where Joe picked up a few new releases he'd been waiting for. "These should keep us busy for a few days," he said, examining the back of one case. His enthusiasm seemed forced, but I didn't press him. After grabbing dinner at our favorite burger place, we stocked up on essentials at the supermarket: chips, soda, microwave meals, and enough coffee to fuel our planned all-night gaming sessions. The normalcy of these routines settled us both. By the time we were heading back to the mountains, Joe seemed more like himself, chatting about work and asking about Mom. The sun had completely disappeared by 6:30 p.m., leaving us driving through darkness, broken only by my truck's headlights. The radio signal gradually deteriorated as we ascended, static interrupting the classic rock station until I finally switched it off. Light rain began to fall, creating hypnotic patterns on the windshield. Still as remote as ever, Joe commented as we turned onto the dirt road leading to my house. The trees crowded close to the path here, branches occasionally scraping against the side of the truck. How do you not go crazy out here alone? I shrugged. You get used to it. Besides, the quiet helps me think. As we rounded the final bend, my headlights swept across the front of the house. For a split second I thought I saw movement on the porch, a quick shadow darting out of the light's reach. I slowed the truck, squinting through the rain-speckled windshield. What is it? Joe asked, following my gaze. Nothing, I replied after a moment. Probably just a raccoon. They've been getting bold lately. We pulled up to the house and quickly unloaded our supplies, making several trips through the light rain. The air felt unusually still despite the weather, as if the forest were holding its breath. Inside, the house was cold. I turned up the thermostat and flipped on lights in every room, dispelling the darkness that had accumulated during my absence. Let's get set up in the living room, I suggested, already unpacking the gaming console. We can push the couch against the wall and use the coffee table for snacks. For the next few hours, we fell into familiar patterns, connecting cables, arguing over game choices, and setting up the perfect arrangement for our marathon session. The rain continued outside, a gentle percussion against the windows. By 10 p.m., we had created our haven of technology within the old wooden house, the television's glow casting strange shadows across the walls. I pushed open the window a few inches to let in fresh air. The room had grown stuffy with our activity, and the cool mountain breeze was welcome. Outside, the darkness was absolute. The forest beyond my small backyard was a wall of black, impenetrable and vast. Neither of us mentioned the unsettling feeling that had begun to creep in with the night. Instead, we launched into our first game. The volume turned high enough to drown out the sounds of the mountain, almost. The movie we'd chosen was some indie horror film Joe had insisted was actually scary, not like that mainstream garbage. The plot was predictable. Vacationing college students, an abandoned cabin, the usual setup, but well executed enough to hold our attention. We were about 40 minutes in when I first heard it. Clink, a metallic sound, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the woods beyond the backyard. It reminded me of two pieces of metal gently tapping together, like a wind chime made of steel instead of aluminum. But we didn't have wind chimes, and the sound was too deliberate, too measured. Joe reached for the remote and paused the movie. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the partially open window. I nodded, trying to rationalize it. Probably just something loose on the shed. The wind picks up at night sometimes. We remained silent, listening. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a damp stillness that amplified every small noise. Just as I was about to dismiss it, the sound came again, clink, slightly louder this time, as if whatever was creating it had moved closer to the house. "Wind, huh?" Joe raised an eyebrow. "Must be the tin roof on the shed," I insisted, though uncertainty had begun to creep into my voice. "It expands and contracts with the temperature." We resumed the movie, but my attention had shifted. Rather than focusing on the screen, I found myself straining to hear above the dialogue, waiting for that metallic sound to return. 20 minutes passed in this heightened state of awareness before it came again. Clink, clink. This time there was no mistaking it. The sound was louder, more insistent, and definitely closer to the house. It reminded me of someone tapping a metal baseball bat against a tree trunk, casual, almost playful, but with an underlying purpose that made my skin prickle. "Okay, that's not the shed," Joe whispered, unnecessarily lowering his voice. "It sounds like it's moving." I reached for the remote and lowered the volume of the movie to a near whisper, not pausing it this time. "Let's act normal," I suggested, though my heart had begun to beat faster. "It's probably just an animal investigating something shiny." But we both knew better. Animals don't create rhythmic metallic sounds. Animals don't slowly circle a house in the dark. For the next half hour, we pretended to watch the movie while focusing all our attention on the sounds outside. The metallic tapping continued, seemingly moving around the perimeter of the house, first near the backwoods, then along the side yard, always keeping its distance, but making its presence known. Should we call someone? Joe asked during a particularly quiet scene in the movie. Call who? The sheriff's station is 40 minutes away. By the time anyone got here, whatever it is would be long gone. I tried to sound rational, but the truth was, I'd reached for my phone twice already, only to realize how ridiculous I would sound. Hello, police? There's a strange clinking sound outside my house. No, I haven't seen anything. Yes, I live in the woods. The metallic sound gradually decreased in frequency, and I found myself relaxing slightly, convincing myself it had been nothing to worry about. But as the movie reached its climax, with the final surviving character making their desperate escape, the sound changed. No longer a gentle clinking, it had transformed into a deliberate, rhythmic tapping like Morse code, sent via metal on wood. And it was coming from directly beneath the open window. Turn off the TV, I whispered, reaching for the remote. The screen went black, plunging the room into near darkness. Only the small lamp in the corner remained lit, casting weak yellow light that barely reached the center of the room. The tapping continued, now with a distinct pattern, 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 slower taps, another pause, then repeat. The sound wasn't just random noise, it was communication. Joe and I exchanged glances, a wordless agreement passing between us. Moving as quietly as possible, we positioned ourselves on either side of the window. The curtains were partially drawn, giving us cover while allowing a narrow view of the yard. On 3, I mouthed, holding up my fingers to count. 1, 2, 3. We both leaned forward simultaneously, peering out into the darkness. The floodlight mounted on the side of the house illuminated a small portion of the yard, creating a pool of yellowish light that ended abruptly at the tree line. Within that illuminated space, there was nothing unusual, just wet grass and the gravel path leading to the shed. But at the edge of the light, where darkness began, something moved. It wasn't a clear sighting, just a disturbance in the shadows, a shifting that suggested mass and intent. Whatever it was, it retreated further into the darkness as soon as we appeared at the window. The tapping stopped. "Did you see that?" Joe's voice was barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My eyes remained fixed on the point where I'd seen the movement, trying to distinguish form from shadow. The longer I stared, the more my vision played tricks on me, creating shapes where there were none. "What do we do?" Joe asked, still whispering despite the closed window between us and whatever waited outside. I considered our options. Calling for help wasn't practical given our location. Ignoring it seemed impossible now that we'd acknowledged its presence. That left confrontation. "We need to know what we're dealing with," I said finally, moving away from the window. "I'm going to grab some flashlights. You stay here and watch the yard." The hallway to the kitchen seemed longer than usual, the shadows deeper. I fumbled in the drawer for the heavy mag light I kept for power outages and a smaller backup flashlight. On impulse, I also grabbed a kitchen knife, slipping it into my back pocket. The weight of it against my spine was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying, a tacit admission that I believed we might be in danger. When I returned to the living room, Joe was still at the window, his face tense with concentration. "Anything?" I asked, handing him the smaller flashlight. He shook his head. "It's completely still out there now. But Mike, I don't think we're alone." I took a deep breath. "I know, let's check it out." "Are you serious? Shouldn't we just lock everything and wait it out? If someone's out there, I want to know why." I tried to project confidence I didn't feel. "Besides, I've lived here my whole life. I know these woods." That wasn't entirely true. No one truly knows the woods at night. The familiar landscape transforms after dark, turning benign landmarks into looming threats and creating hiding places where none existed by day. Nevertheless, I led the way to the front door, switching on my flashlight before stepping onto the porch. The air outside was colder now, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Our breath formed small clouds in the beam of light. "We'll check the floodlight first," I decided, pointing toward the side of the house where we'd seen the movement. "Stay close." We moved carefully around the house, our flashlights sweeping the ground before us. Every step crunched against gravel or squelched in mud, sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. As we approached the side yard, I noticed the floodlight seemed dimmer than usual, its illumination wavering slightly. "Something's wrong with the light," Joe observed, voicing my thoughts. We drew closer, and the reason became immediately apparent. The bulb hadn't burned out. It had been partially unscrewed, just enough to create an intermittent connection that caused the light to flicker. "No animal did that," Joe stated flatly. I reached up and tightened the bulb, restoring the steady glow. As the light stabilized, it revealed fresh indentations in the mud beneath, footprints, partially filled with water but unmistakably human. The metallic sound suddenly resumed, this time from the direction of the woods. Clink, 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 deliberate, mocking. Our flashlights swung toward the tree line in unison, cutting through the darkness to reveal nothing, just trees and underbrush and the impenetrable black beyond our beam's reach. But the sound continued, moving parallel to the edge of the woods, always just outside our field of vision. "It's leading us," Joe whispered, his flashlight tracking the noise. He was right. Whatever created the sound was deliberately staying ahead of us, drawing us toward the woods. A trap, perhaps, or a game where we didn't know the rules. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rain returned, not a gentle mist this time, but a downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet. Water streamed down our faces, soaking through our clothes in seconds. "Back inside," I shouted over the roar of rain on leaves. "Now!" We retreated to the house, locking the door behind us. Soaked and shivering, we stood in the entryway, listening to the storm's assault on the roof. "What the hell was that?" Joe demanded, wiping water from his eyes. "Someone unscrewed your floodlight, Mike. Someone is out there playing some kind of sick game with us." I had no answer that made sense. Rural Tennessee had its share of strange occurrences. Hunters who strayed onto private property, occasional trespassers looking for abandoned buildings to explore, even the rare meth lab hidden deep in the woods. But this felt personal, targeted. "Let's get dried off," I suggested, heading for the linen closet. "Then we need to make sure every door and window is locked." As I handed Joe a towel, a new sound rose above the rainfall. Footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate, directly outside the front door. The footsteps stopped just short of the door. No knock followed, no call identifying the visitor, just the weight of a presence on the other side of the wooden barrier. Joe and I froze in place, dripping water onto the floor, our eyes locked on the doorknob. I held my breath, straining to detect any further movement. After what seemed like minutes, a slow, creaking sound emerged, not from the door, but from the floorboards of the porch, as if whoever stood there was gradually shifting their weight from one foot to another. "Should we see who it is?" Joe whispered. I shook my head emphatically. Something about the situation felt profoundly wrong. Normal visitors don't lurk silently on porches in the middle of a rainstorm. Then came the knocking, not the casual rap of a neighbor or friend, but 3 measured strikes against the wood, so forceful that the door visibly shuddered in its frame. The pattern matched the metallic tapping we'd heard earlier. 3 quick knocks, a pause, 2 slower ones. My hand instinctively moved to my back pocket, fingers wrapping around the handle of the kitchen knife. The weight of it was suddenly inadequate against whatever waited outside. "We know you're in there." The voice that came through the door was male, unfamiliar, and unnervingly calm. "We just want to talk." "We," not I, there was more than one. "What do you want?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response came from the other side of the door. Instead, the porch creaked again as weight shifted away from the entrance. Footsteps circled around the side of the house, the same side where we'd found the loosened floodlight. Joe grabbed my arm. "Did he say we?" he hissed. I nodded, moving toward the living room window that overlooked the side yard. Carefully, I peered through the glass, expecting to see a figure in the floodlight's glow. The yard was empty, but the floodlight itself was now completely dark. They unscrewed it again, I murmured, an inexplicable dread settling into my stomach. This wasn't random mischief, it was calculated intimidation. A sudden bang against the wall made us both jump. It came from directly below the window, where we'd first heard the metallic sounds, a deliberate, violent strike that resonated through the house's wooden frame. Bang, bang, bang! The impacts continued, moving around the perimeter of the house, as if someone were testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. Each strike was followed by scratching sounds, fingernails, or perhaps a tool dragging across the wooden siding. "This is insane," Joe whispered, backing toward the center of the room. "We need to call for help." I pulled out my phone, already knowing what I would find. In these mountains, cell service was spotty at best, non-existent during storms. Sure enough, no signal bars appeared on the screen. "Landline," I muttered, moving toward the kitchen where the old corded phone hung on the wall. It rarely saw use anymore, but Mom had insisted on keeping it active for emergencies. I lifted the receiver to my ear, relieved to hear the dial tone. Quickly, I punched in 911, counting each ring as I waited for a response. 1, 2, 3. On the fourth ring, the line connected, but instead of a dispatcher's voice, I heard only breathing, steady, deliberate breaths that sent ice through my veins. "Hello?" I said cautiously, even though I knew this wasn't the emergency services. The breathing continued for several seconds before a voice responded, the same voice from the porch, now intimately closed through the phone line. "We cut the line a mile down the road," it said matter-of-factly, "but we left just enough connection for this call." Clever, right? I slammed the receiver down, my hand trembling. "What is it?" Joe asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "They cut the phone line," I replied, trying to process the implications. "They planned this. They knew exactly what we would do." The banging against the walls had stopped during my brief call, leaving the house in unnatural silence. Even the rain seemed to have quieted, as if nature itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. "We need a weapon," Joe said, no longer bothering to whisper. "Something better than kitchen knives." I nodded, already moving toward my mother's bedroom. "She keeps a gun in her nightstand. She made me learn how to use it when I started staying here alone." Mom's room was at the far end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, fumbling for the light switch. Nothing happened when I flipped it. "Power's out in this room," I muttered, using my flashlight to navigate toward the bedside table. The beam illuminated familiar surroundings, the neatly made bed, the framed photographs on the dresser, the row of medical textbooks on the shelf. Everything appeared normal until my light reached the window opposite the door. The curtains were open, and pressed against the glass was a face, pale, expressionless, watching us through the darkness. I staggered backward, nearly colliding with Joe. The face remained motionless, features indistinct in the darkness but unmistakably human. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised a hand and pressed it flat against the glass. Long fingers spread wide, leaving smudged impressions on the window pane. "The gun," Joe urged, his voice barely audible. "Get the gun, Mike." Moving by instinct rather than conscious thought, I crossed to the nightstand, keeping my flashlight trained on the window. The figure hadn't moved, continuing its silent observation. The drawer slid open easily, revealing the 9mm handgun my mother had purchased after a series of break-ins targeted isolated homes in the area last year. I'd fired it only twice, once when she first showed me how to use it, and again at the makeshift range we'd set up behind the shed. My fingers closed around the grip, the metal cool against my palm. I checked the magazine, fully loaded just as Mom always kept it. The weight of the weapon steadied my nerves somewhat, giving me a sense of control I'd been lacking since the first metallic sounds. When I looked back at the window, the face was gone. "Where did he go?" Joe whispered, scanning the darkness outside. I moved to the window, careful to approach from the side rather than directly in front. The glass was intact, but the handprint remained, a ghostly impression left behind like a signature. From this vantage point, I could see part of the backyard, including the corner of the shed, approximately 50 yards from the house. The structure was little more than a storage space for gardening tools and outdoor equipment. Its weathered boards and rusted metal roof, a fixture of my childhood. Movement caught my eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness beside the shed. The figure stood there, clearly visible now despite the distance and rain, watching the house with unnatural stillness. "I see him," I murmured, adjusting my grip on the gun. "By the shed." Joe joined me at the window, careful to stay partially concealed behind the curtain. "What's he doing?" "Just standing there watching." We observed in tense silence as the figure remained motionless for nearly a minute. Then, with deliberate slowness, it raised an arm and pointed directly at us, a gesture so precise there could be no doubt it knew exactly where we were, despite the darkness of the room. "He can see us," Joe whispered unnecessarily. I nodded, fighting the urge to back away from the window. Logic dictated that the darkness inside should conceal us, but somehow this intruder knew our exact position. The realization sent a wave of vulnerability through me, unlike anything I'd experienced before. The figure lowered its arm and began walking, not away toward the woods, but directly toward the house. Its gait was unhurried, almost casual, splashing through puddles without concern. "He's coming this way," Joe hissed, genuine fear breaking through his usual composure. I raised the gun instinctively, though I knew I couldn't fire through the closed window at this distance with any accuracy. "Let's get back to the living room," I decided. "We can see all approaches from there." We backed out of the bedroom, keeping our flashlights trained ahead of us. The hallway seemed longer and narrower than usual, the shadows between light beams deeper and more menacing. In the living room, we positioned ourselves strategically, Joe watching the front door and windows, me covering the rear of the house where we'd seen the figure. The gun remained in my hand, safety off, finger resting alongside the trigger, just as Mom had taught me. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. The rain continued its assault on the roof, occasional gusts of wind causing the house to creak and settle. But no footsteps approached, no knocking resumed. "Maybe he changed his mind," Joe suggested after nearly 15 minutes of silence. I shook my head. "No, he's playing with us." As if to confirm my assessment, the metallic clinking sound resumed, this time from multiple directions simultaneously. It surrounded the house, coming from the front porch, the side yard, the back woods, all at once. "There's more than one," Joe whispered, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. The sounds continued, gradually synchronizing until they formed a unified rhythm. Clink, clink, clink. Like a heartbeat made of metal, pulsing around us, and then, abruptly, they stopped. In the sudden silence, I became aware of movement in the backyard, a figure emerging from behind the shed once more. But this time it wasn't alone. Two additional shapes flanked it, emerging from the tree line on either side. "Mike," Joe's voice cracked slightly. "Mike, there's 3 of them now." I moved to his side, staring out at the yard where the 3 figures had formed a loose semicircle facing the house. They maintained perfect stillness, like statues placed in the rain. "What do they want?" Joe whispered, the question directed more to himself than to me. I had no answer, but a terrible certainty was forming in my mind. This wasn't a random intrusion or opportunistic break-in. These people, whoever they were, had targeted us specifically. They had planned this, prepared for it, executed it with precision. One of the figures stepped forward, separating from the others. In its hand glinted something metallic, the source of the clinking sounds we'd been hearing. I couldn't identify the object from this distance, but its purpose became clear as the figure raised it and struck it against what appeared to be a small rod or pipe. Clink. The sound rang out, clearer now that we could see its source. The figure waited a moment, then struck again. Clink. A signal. A summons. From the woods behind them, more shapes began to emerge. One, then two, then several more, until at least 8 figures stood in my backyard, a silent assembly facing the house in the pouring rain. "We need to barricade ourselves," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Help me move the couch against the front door." Joe snapped out of his stunned paralysis, helping me drag the heavy furniture across the room. We positioned it firmly against the entrance, then proceeded to secure the windows, closing and locking each one, drawing curtains, and in some cases pushing bookshelves against them for additional protection. "What about the back door?" Joe asked as we finished with the living room windows. "Kitchen." "Through here." We moved quickly through the house, securing each potential entry point. The back door, a solid wood construction with a deadbolt, was our final target. As I turned the lock, a sound from outside froze me in place. Footsteps on the back porch, multiple sets. "They're right outside," I whispered, backing away from the door. "Back to the living room. Now." We retreated to our makeshift fortress, positioning ourselves behind the overturned dining table we'd arranged as a barrier. The gun felt inadequate against so many intruders, but it was our only substantial defense. Should we try to reason with them? Joe suggested, his voice tight with stress. "Find out what they want." I considered this briefly. Normal logic suggested communication might diffuse the situation, but nothing about this night had followed normal patterns. These people had methodically isolated us, intimidated us, and surrounded us. They weren't here to talk. Before I could respond, a new sound emerged, the distinct scrape of metal against metal from the direction of the back door. Someone was picking the lock. "They're breaking in," Joe whispered unnecessarily. I raised the gun, aiming at the hallway that led to the kitchen. If they came through that door, they would have to pass this point to reach us. The scraping continued for several minutes, occasionally punctuated by low murmurs from outside, too quiet to distinguish words, but clearly human voices conferring. Then abruptly the sounds ceased. Silence fell over the house again, heavy and expectant. I kept the gun trained on the hallway, waiting for the inevitable breach. Instead, a sharp crack came from the front of the house, the sound of splintering wood as someone attacked the front door directly. "They're trying to force their way in," Joe hissed, turning toward the new threat. The assault on the front door continued, measured, powerful strikes that gradually increased in intensity. The couch we'd positioned as a barricade shuddered with each impact, inching backward across the floor despite its weight. Crack! Another hit, stronger than the others. A thin fracture appeared in the wooden door, visible even through the slats of the couch. Crack. The fracture widened, spreading like a lightning bolt across the aged wood. Crack, the door frame splintered, creating a gap just wide enough for fingers to grip the edge. Through that narrow opening, a hand appeared, pale, mud-streaked and methodically working to widen the breach. Without hesitation, I aimed and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, leaving a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The hand disappeared instantly, accompanied by a pained shout from outside. "I hit him," I said, my voice sounding distant through the ringing. "But they'll be back." Joe nodded grimly, his face illuminated by our flashlights in the otherwise dark room. "What now?" Before I could answer, a cacophony of banging erupted, not just at the front door, but from all sides of the house simultaneously. They were attacking every potential entrance at once, a coordinated assault we couldn't possibly defend against. The windows rattled in their frames as objects struck them from outside, not hard enough to break the glass, but with sufficient force to create a constant disorienting noise. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the impacts, as if the entire house were under siege. I fired again toward the damaged front door, then swung around to fire at a window where the curtain had been pushed aside by something outside. Glass shattered, followed by a quick shadow retreating from view. "They're testing our defenses," I realized aloud. "Seeing where we'll shoot." The banging continued unabated, a psychological tactic as much as a physical one. It became harder to track individual sounds or focus on specific threats as the noise surrounded us. I fired again at a shape visible through a side window, then once more at movement near the back hallway. 4 shots fired, 5 remaining in the magazine. Save your ammunition, Joe warned, tracking movement with his flashlight. They're trying to make you waste it. He was right. I lowered the gun slightly, focusing instead on identifying genuine threats rather than responding to every shadow and sound. The assault on the house continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. When it finally ceased, the silence was almost as disorienting as the noise had been. "What are they doing now?" Joe whispered. I strained to hear any movement outside, any clue to our attackers' next move. For several long moments, there was nothing. Then, a sound so unexpected it took me seconds to identify it. Laughter. Low, amused laughter from somewhere just outside the living room window. "They're playing with us," Joe said, his voice hollow. The laughter faded, replaced by footsteps circling the house once more. Unhurried, almost casual in their rhythm. I moved to the window, carefully peering through a crack in the curtains. The yard appeared empty at first glance, but as my eyes adjusted, I detected movement near the tree line. The figures were retreating, melting back into the forest one by one until only a single silhouette remained. Standing at the edge of the woods, this last figure raised a hand, not in threat, but in what almost seemed like farewell. Then it too disappeared into the darkness. "They're leaving," I said, unable to fully believe it. Just like that. Joe joined me at the window, disbelief evident in his expression. "Why? Why do all this and then just leave?" I had no answer that made sense. We remained in position for nearly an hour, waiting for them to return, for the siege to resume. But only silence and darkness greeted us. Eventually, exhaustion began to override adrenaline. I checked and rechecked every entry point, confirming that nothing had been breached besides the damaged front door, which we reinforced with a bookcase. "We should take shifts," I suggested, though I doubted either of us would sleep. "I'll watch first." Joe nodded, settling onto the floor with his back against the wall, flashlight within easy reach. Despite his stated intention to rest, his eyes remained open, scanning the room constantly. I maintained my vigil by the window, gun in hand, watching the tree line for any sign of our tormentors' return. The rain gradually subsided, leaving behind a heavy mist that shrouded the yard in ghostly white. As dawn approached, the first faint light revealed an empty yard, undisturbed except for numerous footprints in the mud, physical evidence that the night's events had not been a shared hallucination. What we couldn't determine, what I still don't know to this day, was why they came, and why they left, without completing whatever dark purpose had brought them to my door. Morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Birds singing, sunlight filtering through the trees, the smell of damp earth rising from the ground. Joe and I moved through the house in a daze, surveying the damage in daylight. The front door was splintered beyond repair, its frame cracked and warped. 3 windows had been broken, their glass littering the floors inside. The walls bore numerous dents and scratches, testament to the coordinated assault we'd endured. "We should call the sheriff," Joe suggested, his voice hoarse from our sleepless night. I nodded, picking up my cell phone. Signal bars had returned with the morning light. The call connected immediately, a dispatcher's professional tone, a surreal contrast to our current situation. I reported the events as coherently as possible, though even to my own ears, the story sounded fantastical. Multiple assailants surrounding an isolated house, communicating with metallic signals, coordinating a psychological siege before disappearing without explanation. It stretched credibility despite being the unvarnished truth. "Deputies will be there within the hour," the dispatcher assured me. "Please don't touch anything that might be evidence." We waited on the porch, the damaged door propped open behind us. The gun remained within reach, though logic suggested our mysterious visitors wouldn't return in daylight. Still, every rustle of leaves or distant sound brought an instant response, heads turning, bodies tensing, ready for a threat that didn't materialize. When the sheriff's cruiser finally appeared on our dirt road, the sense of relief was overwhelming. 2 deputies emerged, expressions serious but skeptical as they surveyed the property. "You boys had quite a night," the older deputy observed, examining the splintered doorframe. His tone carried an undercurrent of doubt, though he maintained professional courtesy. We led them through the house, pointing out the damage and explaining the sequence of events. They took photographs, collected evidence where possible, and recorded our statements with practiced efficiency. "We'll check the phone line," the younger deputy promised. "If it was cut like you said, that'll tell us something." They spent nearly 2 hours at the property, their initial skepticism gradually giving way to concern as the physical evidence supported our account. Before leaving, they promised increased patrols in the area and gave us a direct number to call if the intruders returned. "Lock up as best you can," the older deputy advised. "Might want to stay somewhere else for a few days." Though, after they left, Joe and I sat in silence, the adrenaline that had sustained us finally ebbing away, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. "I'm getting us a hotel room in town," Joe decided, already searching on his phone. "We're not spending another night here until your mom gets back." I didn't argue. The house felt fundamentally changed, no longer the safe haven of my childhood, but a vulnerable shelter that had been violated in ways I still couldn't fully comprehend. We packed essentials quickly, neither of us wanting to remain any longer than necessary. As Joe loaded his bag into my truck, I made a final walk through the house, securing it as best I could given the damaged entrances. In my mother's room, I paused at the window where we'd first seen the face watching us. The handprint remained on the glass, 5 fingers splayed wide, now clearly visible in daylight. I studied it for a moment, then reached out and placed my own hand beside it. The intruder's print was considerably larger than mine, the fingers unnaturally long and thin. It confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't voiced. Whoever these people were, they weren't from around here. Not neighbors, not locals with a grudge, not teenagers playing elaborate pranks. They were something else, entirely. I withdrew my hand, wiping the glass clean with my sleeve, erasing the evidence of their presence in this most personal space. The action felt significant somehow, a small reclamation of territory. The drive to town passed in contemplative silence, both of us processing the night's events in our own way. The hotel was unremarkable, clean, anonymous, secure, everything our experience in the mountains had not been. That evening, the sheriff called with an update. The phone line had indeed been cut approximately a mile from our house, confirming at least part of our story. They'd found no identifiable fingerprints or other evidence that might lead to the intruders. "However, we'll keep looking," he promised. Though his tone suggested limited resources and competing priorities would eventually relegate our case to the unsolved files. Mom returned 3 days later. We told her everything, expecting disbelief, but finding instead grim understanding. Rural isolation carried risks she'd always acknowledged. She didn't question our account or minimize our fear. Instead, she made immediate practical changes, a security system installation, motion-activated lights around the property's perimeter, reinforced doors and windows. Joe returned to the city the following week, carrying with him an experience that had fundamentally altered our friendship. We had shared something profound and inexplicable, a violation that went beyond the physical damage to the house, touching something primal in both of us. As for me, I remained in the mountains, in the house that had always been home. The security upgrades provided a semblance of safety, though I knew them to be largely symbolic. If our visitors decided to return, no amount of technology would truly stop them. They never came back, at least not in the same way, sometimes on particularly quiet nights. I still hear that metallic sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable, clink, 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 always from the direction of the woods. Always just at the edge of perception. I don't investigate anymore. I don't peer through windows or venture outside with flashlights. Instead, I simply acknowledge their presence, a respectful distance maintained between their world and mine. Perhaps that's what they wanted all along, not to harm us, but to establish boundaries, to demonstrate capabilities, to ensure we understood that the isolation we thought protected us actually made us vulnerable. It's been nearly 7 years since that November night. The house has been repaired, the physical evidence long since erased. But I never open the windows after dark anymore, especially when it rains. And I always make sure the floodlights are securely fastened before the sun goes down. Some lessons, once learned, are impossible to forget. In the summer of 1990, my fiancé James and I made the difficult decision to postpone our wedding. The stress of planning had become overwhelming, and we both recognized the need to step back and reconnect. Living on the big island of Hawaii had always been a dream, but island life can become surprisingly routine, even in paradise. Our solution was simple yet ambitious: escape to the mainland, rent a car, buy camping gear, and explore as many national parks as our limited budget would allow. "This is exactly what we need," James said as we finalized our plans one humid evening. "Just us, the open road, and some of the most beautiful places in America." I nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Neither of us were experienced campers, but the adventure appealed to both of us. Growing up in Hawaii meant I had limited exposure to mainland wildlife or extreme weather conditions, while James, having spent his childhood in Northern California, at least had some familiarity with forest environments. We saved every penny we could for 3 months, taking extra shifts and cutting out all unnecessary expenses. By late September, we had enough for flights to San Francisco, a rental car, basic camping equipment, and 2 weeks of travel funds. Our itinerary would take us through parts of California, Nevada, Idaho, and finally Wyoming, where Yellowstone National Park would be the crown jewel of our journey. The night before our departure, I had the first of what would become recurring nightmares. Dreams of being trapped, unable to move, with something immense and threatening hovering just outside my awareness. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing. "It's just pre-trip jitters," James assured me, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Everything's going to be fine." I wished I could believe him. Something about this trip felt different, as if we were moving towards something rather than away from it. Still, I dismissed the feeling as mere anxiety about leaving home and venturing into unfamiliar territory. Our flight to San Francisco was uneventful. We rented a modest compact car, purchased a 4-person tent, sleeping bags, a camping stove, and other essentials from a discount outdoor store. The salesperson, an older man with deep wrinkles carved into weather-beaten skin, eyed us with what I now recognize as concern. "Heading to Yellowstone this late in the season?" he asked, scanning our purchases. "Weather can turn quickly up there. You folks prepared for that?" "We'll be fine," James said confidently. "We're not staying long, just passing through as part of a bigger trip." The man nodded slowly. "Well, just remember, respect the wilderness. It doesn't care about your plans or your comfort." His words followed me out of the store, settling uncomfortably in my mind as we packed our new gear into the trunk of our rental car. Little did I know how prophetic they would prove to be. The first few days of our trip passed pleasantly enough. We explored the redwoods, marveled at the stark beauty of the Nevada desert, and camped at small state parks that were largely empty in the off-season. With each passing day, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, though the nightmares continued, growing more vivid and disturbing. By our 5th day on the road, we were deep into rural Idaho, driving through stretches of land so empty they seemed forgotten by time itself. The radio reception had become increasingly poor, static, interrupting the few stations we could find. When we did catch clear segments, the news was oddly fixated on wildlife incidents. A hiker mauled somewhere in Montana, unusual animal behavior reported in multiple western states, and warnings about being vigilant in wilderness areas. "They're really playing up the dangerous wildlife angle this year," James commented, turning the dial in search of music instead. "Probably trying to keep tourist numbers down now that the summer rush is over." I wasn't so sure. Something about the frequency of these reports felt deliberate, as if they were attempting to prepare people for something without causing panic. But I kept these thoughts to myself, not wanting to dampen our adventure with paranoia. The landscape had transformed into a semi-arid plateau, with scrubby vegetation dotting the rusty soil. We had been driving for hours without seeing another vehicle when a structure appeared in the distance, a dark smudge against the horizon that gradually took shape as we approached. "What is that?" I asked, squinting through the windshield. James slowed the car. "Looks like an old agricultural building. Barn or storage shed, maybe. Should we stop?" The question escaped before I could consider it properly. Something about the building both repelled and drew me, like an itch that demanded to be scratched despite knowing it would hurt. "Why not? We could use a stretch break and I'd like to take some photos." James was already pulling onto the dirt shoulder, dust billowing around our vehicle as we came to a stop. The building stood approximately 200 yards from the road, connected by what might once have been a driveway, but was now just two parallel ruts worn into the hard earth. As we approached on foot, the first thing I noticed was the silence, a complete absence of sound that felt unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the smell. At first, it was just a hint, something that made my nose wrinkle involuntarily. With each step closer, the odor intensified until it became unmistakable. The sickly sweet stench of rotting flesh mingled with the metallic tang of blood. "James," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Something's wrong." He hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Let's just take a quick look. If it's something bad, we can report it in the next town. I should have insisted we leave." That moment of indecision, of allowing curiosity to override instinct, would haunt me for years to come. The building was larger than it had appeared from the road. A steel-framed structure with corrugated metal walls and a high roof. The main door hung partially open, its bottom edge scraping a semicircle in the dirt with each gust of wind. The buzzing of flies grew louder as we approached, a droning chorus that seemed to multiply in volume with each step. James pushed the door wider, and I followed him inside, immediately regretting the decision. The interior was dimly lit by sunlight, filtering through gaps in the metal walls and roof, creating shafts of illumination that highlighted the horror rather than diminishing it. Elk carcasses, or what remained of them, were strewn throughout the space. Not neatly butchered as hunters might prepare them, but savagely torn apart. Limbs separated from torsos, rib cages exposed, internal organs spilled across the concrete floor. Blood had sprayed across the walls in patterns that defied explanation, as if the animals had exploded from within rather than being killed by external force. I pressed my hand over my mouth and nose, fighting the urge to vomit as my eyes catalogued details I wished I could unsee. There were dozens of animals, perhaps 50 or more, in various states of decomposition. Some appeared relatively fresh, while others had clearly been there for weeks. "This isn't right," James muttered, his face pale beneath his tan. He moved further into the building, carefully stepping around the carnage. "Look at how they're torn apart. This wasn't done with knives or tools." "What do you mean?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears, shock already setting in. He knelt beside one carcass, pointing but not touching. "The tissue isn't cut cleanly. It's ripped, like something with enormous strength pulled these animals apart." A sob escaped me before I could suppress it. The implications were too disturbing to contemplate. "We need to call someone. The police, or forest service, or..." "No." James stood abruptly, wiping his hands on his jeans, though he hadn't touched anything. "We're not getting involved in this. We're on vacation trying to relax, remember? This is some poacher's dump site, or maybe someone's sick idea of a joke. This is not a joke, James. Look around you." I gestured wildly at the carnage. "Normal people don't do this." "Exactly why we're leaving now." He gripped my arm, steering me toward the exit. "We'll be at Yellowstone by evening. Let's just focus on that." As we stepped back into the sunlight, I noticed something I'd missed on our approach. Tire tracks, much wider than our rental car would make, and alongside them, indentations in the dirt that didn't match any footprint I recognized. They were massive, widely spaced, and deeply pressed into the hard soil, as if whatever made them carried substantial weight. I opened my mouth to point them out to James, but he was already marching toward our car, keys in hand, clearly intent on putting this place behind us. With one last glance at the building, a glance that revealed dark shapes moving inside that hadn't been there moments before, I ran to catch up with him. We drove in silence for nearly an hour, the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt providing a hypnotic backdrop to my racing thoughts. James stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror as if expecting pursuit. I wanted to discuss what we'd seen, to process the horror through conversation, but his rigid posture discouraged any attempt. When we finally broke the silence, it was to discuss practicalities. How many miles to Yellowstone? Whether we needed to stop for supplies, which campsite we should aim for. The unspoken agreement to avoid mentioning the building full of mangled elk hung between us like a physical presence. The radio crackled to life as we entered an area with better reception, and a news bulletin cut through our forced normalcy. Remains identified as those of Joanna Kemp, a 33-year-old solo hiker from Seattle. Park officials continue to attribute the death to a grisly attack, though some aspects of the case remain unexplained. Visitors to Yellowstone National Park are advised to exercise extreme caution, particularly in remote areas. James switched stations abruptly, landing on one playing outdated pop music. "Needs something a bit more upbeat," he muttered. "Did they say unexplained?" I asked. "Shouldn't a bear attack be pretty straightforward?" He shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "You know how the media exaggerates everything for ratings. They probably just can't confirm it was a grizzly, specifically versus a black bear or whatever." I wasn't convinced, but I let it drop. The day's earlier discovery had left me raw, my usual optimism replaced by a gnawing sense of foreboding that intensified as we approached Yellowstone's western entrance. The massive stone arch welcoming us to the park should have inspired awe and excitement. Instead, I felt as if we were passing through a gateway into something dangerous and unknown. The ranger at the entrance station seemed distracted, barely glancing at our faces as she handed over a map and recited warnings about wildlife safety and fire restrictions. When James mentioned we planned to camp, her attention sharpened momentarily. "Which campground?" she asked, her tone suddenly focused. "We were thinking about one of the more remote ones," James replied. "Away from the crowds. Lewis Lake, maybe?" Her expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "Lewis Lake is closed for maintenance. I'd recommend staying at Madison or Bridge Bay. They're more centrally located and have better facilities." James frowned. "The website said Lewis Lake was open through October. Recent change," she said curtly. "Madison is your best option this time of year." Before he could press further, she turned her attention to the vehicle behind us, a clear dismissal. "That was weird," I commented as we drove away. "Why would they suddenly close a campground in the middle of the season?" "Probably budget cuts or staffing issues," James replied, though he sounded uncertain. "Madison looks nice anyway, and it's closer to the main attractions." Upon reaching Madison Campground, we discovered it was nearly empty, with only a handful of the hundreds of sites occupied. This struck me as odd for late September. Not peak season, certainly, but still pleasant weather for camping. The few other visitors we glimpsed kept to themselves, hurrying between their vehicles and tents with furtive glances at the surrounding forest. We selected a site near the bathroom facilities but separated from other campers by a stand of lodgepole pines. James seemed pleased with the privacy, but I found myself wishing for neighbors, for the reassurance of human proximity in this vast wilderness. As we set up our tent and organized our supplies, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Each time I turned toward the tree line, I expected to see someone or something observing us. But there was only the wind moving through the pines, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that played tricks on the imagination. The remainder of the afternoon passed uneventfully. We prepared a simple meal on our camp stove, listened to the rangers' evening talk at the amphitheater, notably focused on bear safety and the importance of staying on marked trails, and returned to our site as darkness fell. "Weather's turning," James observed, glancing at the sky. The clear blue of earlier had given way to heavy clouds that obscured the stars. "Might get some rain overnight." I nodded, helping him secure our rainfly and ensure our gear was protected. The dropping temperature prompted us to change into warmer clothes and crack open a couple of beers, a small luxury we'd allowed ourselves despite our tight budget. As we sat side by side in our folding chairs, I finally broached the subject I'd been avoiding. "About that building today." "Let's not," James interrupted, taking a long swallow of his beer. "Not tonight. Let's just enjoy being here, okay? We can talk about all that later." Frustrated but unwilling to argue, I retreated into silence. The forest around us had grown quiet as well, the usual nocturnal sounds. Insects, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, noticeably absent. Even the nearby creek seemed muted, its usual babble reduced to a whisper. We finished our beers and prepared for bed, brushing teeth at the bathroom facility and changing into sleep clothes. As we settled into our sleeping bags, lying side by side on the thin foam pads that did little to cushion the hard ground, I remembered the bag of pears I'd purchased at our last stop. "I'm feeling a bit hungry," I whispered to James, who was already drifting towards sleep. "Going to have a pear." He mumbled something incoherent, clearly more interested in rest than fruit. I reached for my backpack, retrieving the small paper bag containing 3 perfectly ripe pears. After eating one, I decided to keep the others close for a middle-of-the-night snack, tucking the bag under my pillow, despite having read all the warnings about not keeping food in tents. "I'm from Hawaii," I justified to myself. "We don't have bears there." This small act of rebellion against park rules felt inconsequential in the moment, a minor oversight born of island habits and exhaustion. I had no way of knowing it would become the focal point of the most terrifying night of my life. Sleep came quickly, despite my unease, the fatigue of travel and emotional strain dragging me under. The dreams began almost immediately. Vivid, disjointed scenes of running through endless forests, pursued by something I couldn't see but sensed was immense and relentless. In the dream-logic way of nightmares, my legs felt increasingly heavy, my movements slowing while the unseen pursuer gained ground. I woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The interior of the tent was pitch black, suggesting the middle of the night. James breathed steadily beside me, undisturbed by my sudden waking. As my racing heart began to slow, I became aware of something wrong, terribly, inexplicably wrong. An immense weight pressed down on the right side of my body from shoulder to hip. The pressure was so intense that breathing became difficult, each inhalation a deliberate fight against the crushing force. My first conscious thought formed with crystal clarity. Bear. There's a bear on top of me. Pure instinct kept me motionless and silent. Even as panic surged through me, some primitive part of my brain recognized that movement or sound might provoke an attack. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the animal to move, to shift its weight, to sniff around for food, to make any sound that would confirm its nature. but nothing happened. The weight remained constant, unnaturally so. No living creature could maintain such perfect stillness. No breathing, no twitching, no subtle adjustments of position, just relentless, unwavering pressure. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My right arm began to tingle, then grow numb from restricted circulation. The discomfort blossomed into pain, but still I didn't move, paralyzed by terror and uncertainty. What kind of animal could remain so completely motionless for so long? And why wasn't it trying to get at the pears that surely it must smell? Another possibility crept into my mind. Perhaps this wasn't an animal at all. Perhaps someone, a person, had entered our tent and was now lying across me for some unfathomable reason. But this made even less sense. A human would breathe, would generate sounds, would eventually speak or act. The most disconcerting aspect was the temperature. Whatever pressed against me radiated heat, not the ambient warmth of a sleeping bag or the cool touch of an inanimate object, but a living heat that seemed to pulse and fluctuate slightly, as if generated by some internal furnace. Time lost all meaning. I tried counting seconds, then gave up. I tried praying, then abandoned that too when no words would form in my mind. I contemplated screaming to wake James, but fear of what might happen if I disturbed whatever was upon me kept me silent. At some point, it could have been 2 hours or 5, I had no way to know. My terror-exhausted brain simply shut down. Consciousness slipped away, not into normal sleep, but something deeper and more absolute, as if my mind had decided that reality was too unbearable to process any longer. When awareness returned, weak morning light filtered through the tent fabric. The weight was gone, leaving behind only a deep ache throughout my right side and a lingering sensation of pressure, like a phantom limb of fear. James was awake, sitting up in his sleeping bag and rummaging through his backpack. He looked over as I stirred, his expression brightening. "Morning, sleepyhead. Thought you might sleep all day?" His tone was light, normal, as if nothing extraordinary had happened in the night. I struggled to sit up, my right side protesting with sharp pain. "James," I managed, my voice rough and unfamiliar to my own ears. "Something happened last night. Something was in the tent with us." His smile faded, replaced by concern. "What are you talking about?" Haltingly, I described the experience, the crushing weight, the unnatural stillness, the hours of terror. As I spoke, James's expression shifted from concern to skepticism, to something approaching anger. "And you brought food into the tent?" he interrupted, focusing on this detail rather than the experience itself. "After all the warnings, all the signs, it was just pears," I defended weakly, "and whatever was on me never moved or tried to get them. It just stayed there." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, you probably had a nightmare, then woke up with your arm asleep from lying on it wrong. With everything we saw yesterday, it's no wonder your subconscious created something scary. This wasn't a nightmare." My voice rose despite my effort to remain calm. I was awake, fully awake for hours. And look, I pushed up my sleeve to reveal angry red marks across my skin, already darkening into bruises that outlined something I couldn't identify. Not a handprint or paw mark, but a pattern of pressure points that followed no logical arrangement. James stared at the marks, his certainty visibly faltering. "That's weird, but it could be from thrashing around during a nightmare or—" "I need to check something," I interrupted, suddenly remembering the pears. I reached under my pillow, finding the paper bag exactly where I'd left it. But when I opened it, I froze. The 2 remaining pears were still there, but they were no longer recognizable as fruit. They had been compressed, crushed with such force that they were reduced to flat discs of pulp, their juices completely extracted and absorbed by something. Not a drop had spilled onto the sleeping bag or pillow. I wordlessly held out the bag for James to see. He took it, examining the destroyed fruit with growing unease. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "If an animal got in, it would have eaten them, not whatever this is. And it would have woken us up," I added. "James, I think we should leave. Now. Today." He looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find a rational counterpoint. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "All right. We'll pack up after breakfast and head somewhere else. Maybe Grand Teton. It's just south of here." I didn't respond, already beginning to gather my belongings, desperate to be away from this place before nightfall returned. As I moved around the tent, I noticed something that had escaped my attention earlier. Fine powder scattered across the floor of the tent, concentrated on the right side where I had slept. I pinched some between my fingers, examining it closely. Mineral dust, like pulverized stone, mixed with what appeared to be ash. Neither of us had brought anything like this into the tent. It hadn't been there when we went to sleep, and there was no logical explanation for how it could have appeared overnight. I showed it to James, who frowned deeply, but offered no explanation. We packed in tense silence, both pretending not to notice the strange tracks in the soft earth around our tent, wide depressions unlike any animal print I recognized. The same pattern I'd seen outside the building with the elk carcasses. Our plan to leave immediately hit an unexpected obstacle. When James turned the key in the ignition, the rental car produced a sickening grinding noise. Then nothing. Several more attempts yielded the same result. The engine would turn over but wouldn't catch. "This can't be happening," James muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "The car was fine yesterday." I said nothing, watching the tree line beyond the parking area with growing unease. The morning was unusually quiet. No birdsong or rustling leaves, despite the light breeze I could see moving the upper branches. The other few campers we'd noticed the previous evening seemed to have departed already, leaving the campground eerily deserted. "I'll check under the hood," James said, popping the release and stepping out. I followed, unwilling to remain in the car alone. Neither of us knew much about engines, but even to our untrained eyes, something was clearly wrong. Components that should have been connected were separated, and several hoses appeared to have been cut rather than broken naturally. Clean, precise cuts that couldn't have been the result of normal wear and tear. "Sabotage," James whispered, voicing what we both suspected. But who would do this? And why? Before I could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle caught our attention. A Park Service truck pulled into the campground, moving slowly along the loop road. Relief washed over me at the sight of official help, but James tensed beside me. "Let me do the talking," he murmured. "Something's not right here." The truck stopped beside our disabled vehicle, and a ranger stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that didn't quite match his professional smile. His name badge identified him as Ranger Wilson. "Having car trouble?" he asked, approaching the open hood. James nodded. "Won't start. Looks like some of the engine components might have been damaged overnight." The ranger peered at the engine, his expression revealing nothing. "That's unfortunate. We've had some issues with wildlife damaging vehicles recently. Bears and elk can be surprisingly destructive when attracted by food smells." "These are clean cuts," I pointed out before James could stop me. "An animal couldn't do this." Ranger Wilson straightened, his smile tightening slightly. "You'd be surprised what can happen in the park, ma'am. All sorts of unusual occurrences." Something in his tone sent a chill through me. He spoke like someone reciting lines they didn't believe, a performance rather than genuine communication. "Is there a mechanic in the park?" James asked. "Or a tow service we could call?" "Cell service is spotty at best," the ranger replied, "and our maintenance staff is stretched thin this time of year. I can radio for assistance, but it might be tomorrow before anyone can get out here." "Tomorrow?" I couldn't keep the dismay from my voice. The thought of spending another night in the park, especially after what had happened, filled me with dread. "Afraid so." The ranger didn't sound particularly sorry. "We're dealing with several incidents throughout the park right now. Resources are limited." James put a reassuring hand on my shoulder, though I could feel the tension in his touch. "We understand. If you could call for that assistance, we'd appreciate it. We'll just have to make the best of another night here." The ranger nodded and returned to his truck, presumably to use the radio. While he was out of earshot, I turned to James. "We can't stay here," I whispered urgently. Not after last night. Not with our car deliberately damaged. I know, he replied, keeping his voice low. But we need to play along until we figure out an alternative. Something's wrong here, with this place, with that ranger. Did you notice he never actually looked at the engine damage? Just glanced at it and immediately suggested animals. I hadn't noticed, but now that James mentioned it, the ranger's behavior did seem odd. More concerning was his casual reference to incidents throughout the park, matching the radio reports we'd heard on our approach. Ranger Wilson returned, informing us that mechanical help would arrive the following morning. He suggested we remain at our current campsite, as it was one of the safer areas in the park, a comment that did nothing to ease my growing paranoia. After he departed, promising to check on us later, James and I retreated to our campsite to discuss options. We kept our voices hushed, both of us now suspicious that we might be monitored somehow. We need to get to a phone, James decided. The ranger station near the west entrance should have one we can use to call for outside help. That's got to be 5 or 6 miles from here, I protested. And what if the rangers are involved in whatever's happening? Not all of them could be, he reasoned. And we don't have to tell them why we're calling. We just need to reach someone outside the park. Your sister, maybe, or my brother. I nodded slowly, seeing the logic in his plan despite my reservations. When do we go? After lunch. We'll pack some essentials in day packs, like we're just going hiking, but head for the station instead of the trails. If anyone questions us, we're just tourists exploring the area. The plan was simple, but offered our best chance at assistance. We spent the next few hours organizing our gear, selecting what to take and what to leave behind, all while maintaining the appearance of normal campers enjoying their stay. Around noon, we set off, following the main road toward the west entrance. We'd gone perhaps a mile when the sound of a vehicle approaching from behind prompted us to step onto the shoulder. The Park Service truck from earlier slowed beside us, Ranger Wilson at the wheel. Heading somewhere? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. Just exploring, James replied smoothly. Thought we'd check out some of the nearby thermal features while waiting for the car repair. The ranger studied us for a moment, his gaze lingering on our backpacks. Some dangerous areas in that direction. The boardwalks near certain hot springs are undergoing repairs. I'd recommend heading toward the lake instead. Safer terrain, better views. We'll keep that in mind, James assured him. Might change course if we run into any closures. Ranger Wilson nodded slowly. See that you do. We've had enough incidents, without adding tourists in restricted areas to our problems. He drove away, but I noticed he didn't go far. The truck pulled into a turnout about a quarter-mile ahead, where it remained stationary, positioned to observe the road in both directions. He's watching us, I whispered, fighting rising panic, waiting to see which way we go. James frowned, considering our options. We'll have to cut through the forest, parallel to the road but out of sight. Once we're past him, we can return to the pavement. I glanced at the dense trees lining the roadside, remembering the strange tracks and disturbing discoveries of the past 2 days. Is that safe? Safer than whatever game the Rangers are playing, James replied grimly. Come on, before he decides to circle back. We slipped into the forest, moving quickly but quietly through the underbrush. The sensation of being watched intensified with each step away from the road, despite no visible observers. The forest itself seemed unnaturally quiet, lacking the small sounds of wildlife that should have been abundant. After 20 minutes of careful progress, we emerged from the trees at a point we estimated to be beyond the ranger's position. The road stretched empty in both directions, no vehicles in sight. We returned to the pavement, increasing our pace now that we were on easier terrain. We had covered perhaps another mile when the first scream reached us, distant but distinct, a human cry of terror or pain that echoed briefly before being cut short with unnatural abruptness. We froze, staring at each other in horrified recognition. That came from ahead of us, James whispered. Near where the station should be. Before I could respond, another sound reached us. The rumble of engines, multiple vehicles approaching rapidly from the direction we'd come. Instinctively, we retreated into the forest edge again, concealing ourselves behind thick trunks just as a convoy of Park Service trucks roared past, heading toward the source of the scream. One of the last vehicles slowed as it approached our position, and I pressed myself more tightly against the tree, hardly daring to breathe. Through gaps in the foliage, I could see Ranger Wilson scanning the roadside, his expression no longer maintaining even the pretense of professional courtesy. His face was taut with focus, almost predatory in its intensity. After what felt like an eternity, he accelerated again, rejoining the convoy as it disappeared around a bend in the road. Only when the sound of engines had faded completely did I allow myself to exhale. "James," I whispered, my voice shaking. "That scream, someone's hurt. Or worse." He nodded, his face pale beneath his tan. "And the Rangers are heading straight for it. Not to help, I think. What do we do now? We can't go to the station if that's where—" I couldn't finish the thought. James was silent for a long moment, weighing our increasingly limited options. We need to find other campers or tourists, someone with a working vehicle who can get us out of here. The main visitor center near Old Faithful should have hundreds of people, even this late in the season. "That's miles from here," I pointed out. "In the opposite direction from our campsite." "I know. But I don't think going back to our tent is safe anymore. Not after Ranger Wilson has taken such an interest in our movements." The logic was sound, if terrifying. We had no way of knowing what awaited us at Old Faithful, but standing still or returning to our isolated campsite seemed even more dangerous. With reluctance born of necessity, we set off deeper into the park, staying within the tree line parallel to the road, moving as quickly and quietly as the terrain allowed. The weight of unknown danger pressed around us, as tangible and threatening as what had lain upon me during the night. The journey to Old Faithful proved more arduous than anticipated. What should have been a 4-hour walk stretched into 6 as we navigated rough terrain, avoiding the main roads where park vehicles periodically passed. By the time the visitor center came into view, afternoon was fading toward evening, the sky darkening with both approaching night and gathering storm clouds. From our vantage point at the forest edge, we could see the famous geyser area and surrounding facilities, and what we saw confirmed our worst fears. The vast parking lot, which should have held hundreds of vehicles at this hour, contained only a handful of cars clustered near the main building. The boardwalks and viewing areas around the geyser field stood empty, cordoned off with official-looking barriers and warning signs. "This isn't right," James murmured. "Even in the off-season, this place should be packed with tourists waiting for the eruption." I nodded, unease crawling up my spine. "And where are all the staff? There should be rangers, maintenance workers, gift shop employees." The visitor center itself showed signs of hasty abandonment, doors propped open, trash cans overflowing, an information board with papers fluttering in the breeze. None of the few remaining vehicles had civilian license plates. All bore the distinctive government markings of Park Service or other federal agencies. "We need to get closer," James decided after a lengthy observation. "There might be a phone inside the visitor center we could use. And if there are rangers inside?" The memory of Ranger Wilson's predatory expression remained vivid in my mind. "We'll be careful. Stay low, move quickly, and check through windows before entering any building." With no better alternative, I followed James as he led the way across the open ground between forest and buildings, using the growing shadows for cover. We reached the rear of the visitor center without incident, pressing ourselves against the wall as voices drifted from an open window nearby. "Containment protocols are failing," a tense male voice was saying. 3 more breaches in the north quadrant last night, and we lost 2 more staff at the west entrance today. The fence line was supposed to be secure by now," a second voice responded, female and authoritative. "What happened?" "Engineers say the substrate is too unstable for proper anchoring. And the things are stronger than anticipated, much stronger. They're pushing through reinforced concrete like it's cardboard. A heavy sigh then. The evacuation order should have come days ago. We've lost too many civilians already. Orders from above were clear: maintain public access to non-restricted areas while containment proceeded. Minimize panic, preserve the tourist economy, and look where that's gotten us. Half the park compromised, 24 dead, and God knows how many of those things now roaming beyond the original site. James and I exchanged horrified glances. Whatever disaster was unfolding in Yellowstone, it was far worse than we had imagined, and the authorities had deliberately kept visitors in the dark, prioritizing damage control over safety. The conversation inside continued, providing fragmented but disturbing insights, references to an excavation site near the lake, specimens that had escaped containment, and unusual biological properties that defied scientific understanding. Most chilling was the casual discussion of casualties, both among park staff and visitors, described in the detached language of acceptable losses. When the voices moved away from the window, James signaled for us to continue around the building. We found a side entrance unlocked and slipped inside, finding ourselves in a deserted corridor lined with administrative offices. Most doors were closed, but one stood partially open, light spilling from within. Cautiously we approached, peering through the gap. The office beyond was empty of people, but filled with evidence of the unfolding crisis. Maps of the park, with large sections marked in red. Incident reports scattered across a desk, and most disturbing, photographs pinned to a corkboard. I pushed the door wider, drawn to these images, despite my fear. They showed what appeared to be excavation work around one of the thermal features, a massive dig site with scientific equipment and personnel in protective gear. Later photos documented what had been uncovered, structures that resembled neither natural formations nor human architecture, composed of a material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The final series of photographs turned my blood to ice. They showed damage to equipment and facilities, injuries to personnel, and glimpses of what had caused them. The images were blurry, taken during movement or poor lighting conditions, but they captured enough. Massive forms moving with impossible speed, appendages that seemed to shift and reconfigure, surfaces that appeared both solid and fluid simultaneously. "James," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "These aren't animals. They're not anything I've ever seen." He nodded slowly, his face ashen as he examined a topographical map with multiple red circles expanding outward from a central point near Yellowstone Lake. "I think they found something underground, something that was contained until they disturbed it, and now it's loose in the park." The realization hit me with physical force. The elk in that building, the hiker they said was killed by a bear. What happened in our tent last night? It's all connected. Before James could respond, voices in the corridor alerted us to approaching danger. We retreated behind the office door, holding our breath as two people walked past, a man in a ranger uniform and a woman in what appeared to be military fatigues, deep in conversation about perimeter security and extraction protocols. Once they had passed, we slipped out of the office and continued our search for a functioning telephone. In the main lobby area, now eerily deserted, we found what we were looking for: a courtesy phone for visitor use, mounted on the wall near the information desk. James lifted the receiver, his expression shifting from hope to despair. "Dead," he reported, replacing it. "They must have disconnected external lines." A noise from the entrance caused us both to duck behind the desk. Through the glass doors, we could see several park vehicles arriving, disgorging uniformed personnel who moved with the coordinated efficiency of military operations rather than park rangers. "We need to leave," James whispered urgently. "Now, before they secure the building." We retreated the way we had come, slipping out the side entrance just as voices filled the lobby behind us. Rather than return to the forest immediately, James led us toward the parking area, moving from shadow to shadow between the few remaining vehicles. "What are you doing?" I hissed, anxiety making my voice sharp. "Looking for transportation," he replied grimly. "We're miles from any exit, and whatever's happening is spreading. Our only chance is to drive out while we still can." Most of the vehicles were locked, but we eventually found an older model park service truck with keys left in the ignition, perhaps abandoned hastily during an emergency response. James helped me into the passenger seat before sliding behind the wheel, starting the engine as quietly as possible. "Keep your head down," he instructed as we pulled away from the visitor center. "Headlights off, despite the gathering darkness. I'll take the west exit road. It should be the fastest way out of the park." We had gone perhaps a mile when the radio mounted below the dashboard crackled to life, making us both jump. "All units, be advised, multiple containment failures reported in sectors 3, 7, and 12. Unknown number of specimens now active outside established perimeters. All personnel are instructed to retreat to designated safe zones. Repeat, retreat to designated safe zones immediately." James switched off the radio, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We need to get out of here fast." He accelerated, abandoning caution as the full urgency of our situation became clear. The truck's headlights cut through the deepening gloom, illuminating an empty road ahead, until it wasn't empty anymore. Something massive moved across the pavement perhaps 50 yards ahead, a shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with proportions that shifted as it moved, defying visual comprehension. It paused in the center of the road, oriented toward our approaching vehicle with what might have been attention. Though no recognizable sensory organs were visible, James slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. For an endless moment, we stared at the thing blocking our path, and it seemed to regard us in return. Then, with a movement too quick to follow, it was gone, vanishing into the forest beside the road. "What was that?" I whispered, though I knew James had no more answers than I did. He shook his head, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "I don't know, but I think it's what was in our tent last night. What crushed those pears? What's been killing people in the park?" With trembling hands, he put the truck back in gear and continued forward, more slowly now, alert for any further appearances of the entity. We drove in tense silence, jumping at every shadow and sound, the weight of unseen dangers pressing in from the darkness around us. The western exit road stretched before us, eerily deserted as we continued our flight from the horrors of Yellowstone. Rain had begun to fall, light at first, but quickly intensifying into a downpour that reduced visibility and transformed the pavement into a treacherous, reflective surface. James drove with intense concentration, hands gripping the wheel at precisely 10 and 2. Eyes constantly scanning the road and surrounding forest. I kept watch as well, dividing my attention between the side mirrors and the tree line, dreading another glimpse of the entity we'd encountered. The rational part of my mind struggled to process what we'd seen, attempting to categorize it within familiar parameters: animal, machine, optical illusion. But it had been none of these things. It had existed outside the taxonomy of known life, a violation of natural law made manifest. "We should be reaching the park boundary soon," James said, breaking the lengthy silence. His voice sounded strained, higher pitched than normal. "There's usually a checkpoint, but with everything that's happening..." He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. The normal rules and structures might no longer apply. The authorities had lost control of whatever they'd unearthed, and the carefully maintained veneer of safety had collapsed. The rain intensified further, becoming a solid wall of water that the truck's wipers struggled against futilely. James slowed our pace, leaning forward as if those few additional inches might improve visibility. I was about to suggest pulling over to wait out the worst of the storm when the headlights illuminated something ahead. Not another entity, but a barricade across the road, heavy concrete barriers arranged in a staggered pattern to prevent vehicles from passing. James braked carefully, bringing us to a stop about 20 yards from the obstruction. Beyond the barriers, I could make out the distinctive stone marker that signified the park boundary, so close, yet unreachable by this route. "They've sealed the exits," James stated flatly, unnecessary confirmation of what we could both see. "There must be another way," I insisted, fighting rising panic. "A service road or a hiking trail wide enough for the truck?" James studied the map glove compartment, using the dome light despite the risk of being spotted. "There's a fire road that branches off about a half-mile back. It eventually connects to the main highway outside the park, but it's probably not maintained and could be rough going in this weather." With no better options, we backtracked to find the turnoff, an unmarked dirt track that veered sharply into the forest, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain in the darkness and rain. The truck lurched as we left the pavement, its suspension groaning in protest as we navigated the uneven surface. Progress slowed to a crawl as the road deteriorated, mud and exposed roots creating obstacles that required careful maneuvering. The trees pressed close on either side, branches scraping against the windows and roof with unsettling persistence. Our headlights created a tunnel of visibility that extended perhaps 30 feet ahead. Everything beyond remained impenetrable darkness. After what felt like hours but was likely less than one, the road widened slightly, the terrain becoming more navigable. James increased our speed cautiously, hope returning as we detected signs of approaching civilization. Tire tracks other than our own, occasional reflective markers on trees, the distant glow of lights beyond the forest canopy. That hope was short-lived. As we rounded a bend, our headlights revealed another barricade ahead, this one manned by figures in what appeared to be hazmat suits rather than ranger uniforms. They stood beside large vehicles with government markings, and upon noticing our approach, several raised weapons in our direction. James reacted instantly, wrenching the steering wheel to the left and accelerating into the forest beside the road. Branches and underbrush scraped against the truck as we plunged deeper into the trees, pursuing a desperate gamble that there might be enough space between trunks to allow passage. Behind us, shouting voices and the beams of powerful flashlights indicated pursuit had begun. The truck bounced violently as we traversed the uneven forest floor, each impact threatening to throw us against the roof or dash. I clung to the door handle with one hand and the seat with the other, certain that at any moment we would hit an obstacle substantial enough to halt our flight. That moment came with stunning abruptness. The front wheels dropped suddenly into a concealed depression, the impact throwing us forward against our seatbelts with bruising force. The engine stalled, and James's repeated attempts to restart it produced only a grinding noise that confirmed serious damage. "We have to run," he decided, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "They're coming, and we can't stay with the truck." I nodded, fumbling with my own restraint as fear made my fingers clumsy. We exited into the pouring rain, the cold immediately penetrating our inadequate clothing. The voices and lights of our pursuers were closer now, perhaps 100 yards behind us and closing rapidly. James grabbed my hand, pulling me deeper into the forest, away from both the disabled truck and the approaching search party. We ran as best we could through the darkness, guided more by what we could feel than what we could see, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches whipping at our faces and bodies. The terrain began to slope downward, the ground becoming increasingly treacherous with mud and loose stones. Our pace slowed despite the urgency, self-preservation instincts warring with the need for speed. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter behind us, whether because we were outpacing them or because they had elected to remain with the truck. I couldn't tell, just as I began to think we might have escaped. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling forward. James, still holding my hand, was pulled off balance as well. Together we tumbled down the increasingly steep slope, a chaotic descent of impacts and disorientation that ended only when we splashed into cold, shallow water at the bottom. I lay stunned for several moments, cataloguing injuries, scraped palms, bruised ribs, a sharp pain in my right ankle that suggested a sprain, if not a fracture. Beside me, James groaned, pushing himself to a sitting position in what I now realized was a narrow stream bed. "Are you okay?" he whispered, hands moving carefully over my limbs, checking for serious damage. "I think so," I replied, though my body protested as I attempted to rise. "Nothing broken you?" "I'll live." His voice was tight with pain, but he managed to stand, then helped me up. "We need to keep moving. Follow the stream. It has to lead somewhere, and it'll be easier than trying to navigate the forest in this weather." He was right on both counts. The streambed provided a relatively clear path through the otherwise dense vegetation, and the flowing water would mask our tracks from pursuers. We moved downstream as quickly as my injured ankle would allow, using the steep banks on either side for occasional support. The rain continued unabated, soaking us to the skin and reducing visibility to mere feet. Under other circumstances, I might have worried about hypothermia or flash flooding. Now, these concerns seemed trivial compared to what lay behind us in the park. After an indeterminate period of sloshing through the shallow water, the stream widened and deepened, its banks gradually flattening out. Ahead, we could see lights, not the searching beams of our pursuers, but the steady illumination of buildings or streets. "I think we're approaching a town," James said, hope evident in his voice despite his exhaustion, somewhere outside the park boundary. The stream eventually passed beneath a small bridge, beyond which lay what appeared to be the outskirts of a modest settlement. We climbed out of the water onto a grassy bank, then made our way cautiously toward the nearest structures, a cluster of small houses set back from a two-lane road. "We need to find a phone," James decided. "Call for help." "Who would believe us?" I asked, the question that had been forming in my mind throughout our ordeal finally finding voice. "What we saw, what we learned, it sounds insane." "We don't have to tell them everything," he reasoned. "Just that we're stranded travelers who escaped a dangerous situation in the park. My brother can drive up from Salt Lake City. It would take him about 6 hours, but he'd come." The plan made sense, though I remained doubtful that escape would prove so simple. Whatever forces had contained the park's secret would likely not want witnesses wandering free, sharing their experiences. We approached the nearest house, a small rancher with lights visible in the windows despite the late hour. James knocked on the door, both of us trying to appear less desperate and disheveled than we actually were. After a long moment, the door opened a crack, revealing an elderly man peering out suspiciously. "What do you want?" he demanded, taking in our bedraggled appearance with evident distrust. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," James began, summoning a calm tone that belied our circumstances. "My fiancée and I had car trouble in the park, and we're stranded. Could we possibly use your phone to call for help?" The old man's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complex, a mixture of fear and recognition that made my skin crawl. "You came from the park?" "Tonight." We nodded, and he glanced past us toward the distant forest before opening the door wider. "Get in quickly," he ordered, ushering us into a small, cluttered living room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. As he secured multiple locks on the door behind us, I exchanged a worried glance with James. Had we escaped one danger only to walk into another? "Who's it?" the man instructed, gesturing toward a worn sofa. "You're not the first to come this way." "Not by a long shot." This statement, delivered matter-of-factly, stunned us both into silence. The old man disappeared briefly into another room, returning with towels that he tossed in our direction before settling into a recliner opposite the sofa. "My name's Howard," he introduced himself, studying us with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "And you two have seen something you weren't supposed to see, haven't you?" Howard proved to be our unexpected salvation. Not only did he provide dry clothes, food, and shelter for the night, but he also possessed knowledge that helped contextualize our terrifying experiences. "They found something in the thermal areas about 2 years ago," he explained as we sat around his kitchen table, mugs of strong coffee warming our hands. Some kind of structure or artifact buried deep. Government types swarmed in, not just park rangers but military personnel, scientists with specialized equipment. Locals were told it was a research project studying the geothermal features, but they kept extending the restricted areas, adding more security. Did anyone know what they found? James asked. Howard shrugged. Rumors mostly. Some said it was advanced technology, maybe Russian or Chinese. Others thought it might be evidence of ancient civilizations. The truth is stranger from what I've gathered. They uncovered something alive, I said quietly. Something that escaped. The old man's gaze sharpened. You saw them. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. One of them. On the road, and I think one was in our tent the night before. Howard didn't dismiss my account or question my sanity. Instead, he nodded gravely. They're drawn to certain things, heat, specific organic compounds, and they can flatten themselves almost two-dimensional when they want to, squeeze into spaces you wouldn't think possible. How do you know all this? James asked, suspicion evident in his tone. My son-in-law worked security for the initial excavation. He disappeared 7 months ago along with half his team. Official report said it was a tragic accident involving toxic gas from the thermal features. Howard's weathered face hardened with barely contained grief and anger. But he'd been sending me notes, recordings. He knew something was wrong with what they found, said it wasn't dead like they thought, just dormant. This confirmation of our worst fears should have terrified me further, but somehow it provided a strange relief. We weren't crazy. What we had experienced was real, however impossible it seemed. Howard continued, about 3 months ago, the containment measures started failing. They tried to keep it quiet, but people in the surrounding communities noticed, visitors with strange injuries being airlifted out, bizarre animal deaths in expanding patterns from the park center. Local authorities were told it was a particularly aggressive bear population, combined with unusual thermal activity. And the roadblocks? James asked. The evacuation started in stages about 2 weeks ago. They called it a controlled visitor reduction due to environmental concerns. Most tourists left voluntarily. The rest... He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. I thought of the half-empty campgrounds, the closed areas, the rangers' casual reference to incidents throughout the park. How many people had encountered what we had, or worse, with no chance to escape? Howard provided the use of his phone, and James contacted his brother as planned. The explanation he gave was carefully edited. Car trouble, park closures, and a need for immediate extraction. His brother agreed to drive up immediately, expected to arrive by mid-morning. While we waited, Howard showed us newspaper clippings he'd collected, seemingly unrelated incidents across the western states that, viewed together, suggested a pattern. Unusual animal deaths similar to the elk we'd discovered, missing hikers and campers in remote areas, unexplained property damage that authorities attributed to vandalism or weather. They're spreading, Howard stated grimly. Whatever containment protocols they had in place have failed completely, and they can't acknowledge it publicly without revealing what they found in the first place. Why not just tell people? I asked. Warn them about the danger? Howard gave a humorless laugh. Think about it. The government admits they uncovered some unknown life form that defies scientific understanding, accidentally released it, and now can't control it. The panic would be immediate and overwhelming. Easier to cover it up, contain the spread quietly if they can, and maintain the illusion of normalcy. That night, despite my exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Each time I began to drift off, my body would jerk awake, the phantom sensation of weight on my right side returning with vivid intensity. James seemed similarly affected, tossing and turning on the fold-out couch we shared in Howard's spare room. In the grey light of early morning, I finally voiced the question that had been troubling me since our escape. What happens now? Do we just go back to our lives and pretend this never happened? James was silent for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. "I don't think we can," he finally replied. "Not completely. What we saw, what we experienced, it changes things. Changes us." He was right. The orderly world I had inhabited before Yellowstone, with its predictable patterns and comprehensible dangers, no longer existed for me. I had glimpsed something beyond conventional understanding, and that knowledge could never be unknown. Howard made a similar point over breakfast as we discussed our immediate plans. "They'll be looking for you," he warned. "Not actively at first. They have bigger problems right now. But eventually, they'll track down everyone who might have seen something, who might talk." "What should we do?" I asked, the implications of his warning settling like a cold weight in my stomach. "Be careful what you say and who you say it to," he advised. "Consider relocating somewhere far from here. And watch for signs. You've seen them once. You'll recognize the indicators if they appear in your area." James's brother arrived mid-morning as promised, concerned but mercifully unquestioning about the specifics of our situation. We thanked Howard for his help, exchanged contact information, and departed for Salt Lake City, leaving behind the visible boundaries of Yellowstone, but carrying its invisible influence with us. In the months that followed, we did relocate, not back to Hawaii, which suddenly seemed too isolated if problems arose, but to the eastern seaboard, far from the expanding pattern of incidents that Howard continued to track and share with us through carefully coded communications. We never spoke publicly about what we had experienced. Who would believe us? Even if they did, what purpose would it serve beyond spreading fear? Instead, we watched and waited, alert for signs that what had escaped Yellowstone had spread further than expected. Our wedding remained postponed indefinitely. The future we had planned seemed distant and uncertain now, overshadowed by knowledge we hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. James focused on work with unusual intensity, while I found myself drawn to research, studying, scientific journals and news, reports for any mention of unexplained phenomena that might connect to what we had witnessed. Dreams of the entity persisted, for both of us, not nightly, but recurring with enough frequency to ensure we never fully escaped its influence. In my dream state, I would feel that immense, unmoving weight again, pressing me into immobility, while something unfathomable studied me with senses I couldn't comprehend. Sometimes I wonder if we made the right choice in fleeing, in remaining silent about what we encountered. Perhaps our knowledge could have helped others, provided warning or insight that might save lives. But when I read between the lines of news reports, when I see familiar patterns emerging in seemingly unconnected incidents, I understand that the forces at work are beyond any individual's capacity to influence. The truth about what was discovered beneath Yellowstone remains officially hidden, classified and contained behind layers of government secrecy. But the consequences of that discovery continue to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the park's boundaries, including ours. Last week I felt it again, that distinctive pressure on my right side, present for just a moment before vanishing. Not in a tent in Wyoming, but in our secured apartment 1,500 miles away. James insists it was just a vivid memory, a physical manifestation of trauma resurfacing. I wish I could believe him. But I know what I felt, and I know with cold certainty that what began in Yellowstone has not ended. It has merely dispersed, spreading through the world's forgotten spaces, patient and persistent, watching, waiting, learning, and sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, I wonder if what we encountered was truly alien at all, or if it represents something that has always been here, dormant beneath the surface of our reality, disturbed from ancient slumber by human curiosity and carelessness. Either possibility offers little comfort as I lie awake, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist, feeling for pressure that shouldn't be possible, and hoping that the weight of knowledge is the only burden I'll be forced to bear in the darkness. It was late May of 2021 when my husband Michael, our friend Bella and I decided to embark on what we thought would be a refreshing wilderness adventure. After 18 months of pandemic restrictions, the wide open spaces of Big Bend National Park in Texas seemed like the perfect escape from our claustrophobic urban existence in Austin. We weren't exactly seasoned outdoors people, but we weren't novices either. I'd grown up on 8 acres of forested land in East Texas, where coyotes were frequent visitors. Michael had been a Boy Scout and had maintained his love for hiking well into adulthood. Bella was the most experienced among us, having spent several summers as a camp counselor and guide in the Appalachians. "I think we should really push ourselves this time," Bella suggested during our planning session at our kitchen table. "Big Bend offers primitive camping areas where we can truly disconnect." Michael nodded enthusiastically while scrolling through pictures of the park's vast desert expanses and dramatic canyons. "Some of these remote sites look incredible. We could have the stars all to ourselves." I felt a slight hesitation. While I appreciated nature, I also respected its dangers. "Are we sure we're ready for primitive camping? That's pretty isolated if something goes wrong." "That's part of the appeal," Bella countered, her eyes bright with excitement. "When was the last time we did something that pushed us out of our comfort zones?" I couldn't argue with that logic. The pandemic had shrunk our worlds considerably, and the prospect of wide open spaces held tremendous appeal. Besides, we would be prepared. We had decent gear, would bring ample supplies, and between the three of us, possessed a reasonable amount of outdoor knowledge. "You're right," I conceded, warming to the idea. "Let's do it." We spent the next 3 weeks researching, purchasing additional equipment, and plotting our route. We settled on a primitive camping area called 9 Points Raw, a desolate location near the park entrance. Approximately 25 miles from the visitor center and lodge, and about 40 miles from the Rio Grande village. In other words, we would be nowhere near civilization. As our departure date approached, I experienced occasional flashes of anxiety about the trip. Twice, I dreamed of being lost in endless desert, searching for a campsite that kept moving just beyond the horizon. I dismissed these as pre-trip jitters and focused instead on the packing list I'd meticulously created. The night before our departure, as Michael slept soundly beside me, I found myself wide awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling. A thought surfaced from some primal part of my brain. There are things in the wilderness that we don't understand. I pushed the thought away and eventually drifted into an uneasy slumber. We left Austin early on a Friday morning, the SUV packed tightly with our gear. The drive to Big Bend takes about 7 hours from Austin, not counting stops. As we moved southwest, the landscape gradually transformed from the hill country's gentle slopes to increasingly arid terrain. By the time we passed through Marathon, the last town before the park, the scenery had become decidedly desert-like. Sparse vegetation, exposed rock formations, and vast stretches of apparent nothingness. "It's so empty out here," Michael commented, voicing what we were all thinking. "Makes you feel small." Bella, who was driving at this point, nodded. "That's the beauty of it. We forget how much space there actually is in the world when we're cramped in cities." "Or how insignificant we are," I added, feeling a strange mixture of awe and unease as I gazed at the harsh landscape. The desert didn't care if we existed. It would remain long after we were gone. We reached the park entrance around 3:30 p.m. After checking in at the ranger station and obtaining our permits, we received a brief orientation about park rules, wildlife awareness, and emergency protocols. The ranger, a weathered woman in her 50s named Ranger Martinez, studied our permit with a slight frown. 9 Points Raw? That's quite isolated, she remarked. "You folks have primitive camping experience?" "We do," Bella assured her confidently. "Good. Just remember, cell service is non-existent out there, and the nearest help is a good hour away by vehicle." She handed us a map with our camping area circled. "Stay aware of your surroundings, especially at night. We've had more wildlife activity than usual this season." "What kind of wildlife?" I asked. The usual desert creatures, coyotes, javelinas, the occasional mountain lion. Nothing to worry about if you take proper precautions. She paused. Also, temperatures drop significantly at night this time of year. Be prepared for that. We thanked her for the information and headed back to our vehicle. As we drove deeper into the park, the landscape became increasingly dramatic. Towering mesas, undulating hills, streaked with layers of mineral deposits, and the occasional burst of desert flora, adding splashes of muted color to the predominantly tan and rust-colored panorama. "It's beautiful," I said, "but somehow forbidding." "That's what makes it exciting," Michael replied, eyes scanning the horizon. "It's one of the few places left that hasn't been tamed." We reached the turnoff for 9 Points Raw just after 4 p.m. The final stretch to our designated camping area involved navigating a rough dirt road that tested our SUV's suspension. When we finally arrived, the isolation was immediately apparent. The nearest other campsite must have been miles away. We were truly alone. Our camping spot was situated on a flat expanse of desert, with scattered creosote bushes and ocotillo plants providing minimal texture to the otherwise barren surroundings. In the distance, rugged hills rose dramatically against the intensely blue sky. The silence was profound, an absence of sound so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. "Well," Bella said, breaking the silence, "this is exactly what we wanted." We set to work immediately, knowing we had limited daylight remaining. Michael and I assembled our tent while Bella organized our cooking gear. By 5:30 p.m., our camp was established, tent secured, supplies organized, and a small designated cooking area prepared. As the sun began its descent, the temperature started to drop and the quality of light transformed. The desert took on golden hues, with long shadows stretching across the ground. It was breathtakingly beautiful, yet as darkness approached, I couldn't shake a growing sense of vulnerability. Out here, we were exposed in a way that felt both liberating and deeply unsettling. After setting up camp, we sat in our folding chairs, eating the sandwiches we'd prepared before leaving Austin. The approaching sunset painted the landscape in dramatic oranges and purples, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. "What's the plan for tomorrow?" Michael asked, opening a can of beer. Bella pulled out her map. "I was thinking we could hike toward Grapevine Hills in the morning while it's still cool. It's about a 6-mile round trip from here." As they discussed potential routes, my attention drifted to the darkening horizon. The vastness of the park was beginning to register in a visceral way. Hundreds of thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding us, most of it rarely touched by human feet. "What about tonight?" I asked, turning back to the conversation. "It seems a shame to just sit in the tent once it gets dark." Bella's eyes lit up. "I was hoping you'd say that." "What about a night hike? The moon is nearly full, and the trail to Coyote Flat is supposedly amazing at night." "How far is that?" Michael asked. "About 2 miles each way. Nothing too strenuous, but far enough to feel like we're really experiencing the desert at night." I considered this. Night hiking wasn't something we'd done before, but the idea held a certain appeal. The desert would transform after dark, revealing aspects invisible during daylight. "I think we should do it," I said, surprising myself with my enthusiasm. "But let's be prepared. I want to scout the route while we still have light." We agreed that would be sensible. While Michael finished organizing our sleeping arrangements, Bella and I set out to explore the potential route for our night hike. The terrain was mostly flat desert with scattered ground vegetation, easy enough to navigate during the day, but potentially confusing after dark. "We should mark the path," I suggested as we walked. "Otherwise, we might get turned around out here. Everything looks the same." Bella nodded in agreement. "Good thinking." We spent the next hour creating small rock piles every 50 feet or so along our proposed route. These cairns would serve as our breadcrumb trail back to camp. The physical activity helped dispel some of my earlier unease, replacing it with a sense of preparation and control. "This should work well," Bella said, as we placed the final marker about a mile from camp. "We can easily follow these back." As we returned to camp, the sunset had progressed to its final stages, with just a sliver of fiery orange remaining on the horizon. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I shivered despite my jacket. "Second thoughts?" Bella asked, noticing my reaction. "No, just getting used to the temperature swing," I replied. "I'm actually looking forward to seeing this place at night." Back at camp, we prepared a simple dinner of rehydrated camping meals heated on our portable stove. As we ate, stars began appearing overhead. First just a few bright points, then dozens, hundreds, thousands, until the sky was overflowing with light. The Milky Way emerged as a luminous band stretching across the heavens. "Worth the trip just for this view," Michael murmured, gazing upward. We planned to set out on our night hike around 10 p.m., giving our food time to settle and allowing the full majesty of the night sky to develop. As we waited, we sipped hot chocolate and shared stories of previous outdoor adventures, though none compared to the isolation we were currently experiencing. At 9:45 p.m., we gathered our equipment for the hike: headlamps, water bottles, a small first aid kit, and walking sticks. Despite the bright moonlight, I insisted we each carry backup flashlights and extra batteries. "Ready for an adventure?" Bella asked, securing her headlamp. I nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Ready as I'll ever be. We set out from our campsite at precisely 10 p.m., our headlamps cutting bright swaths through the darkness. Despite the moonlight, which bathed the landscape in silver, the desert at night felt fundamentally different from its daytime incarnation. Shadows pooled in unexpected places, and familiar objects took on strange, almost threatening forms. The first 10 minutes of our hike proceeded uneventfully. Our spirits were high as we followed the trail of rock cairns I had placed earlier. The desert air was crisp and clean, carrying the subtle scent of creosote and dust. Above us, the night sky displayed its full glory, stars so numerous and bright that they seemed almost within reaching distance. "This is incredible," Michael whispered, his voice unconsciously hushed by the vastness surrounding us. "I've never seen the stars so clearly." "It's because we're so far from light pollution," Bella explained. "Plus, the desert air has less moisture to distort the light." I was about to respond when a sound caught my attention. A faint, scuttling noise approximately 50 feet behind us. I paused, turning my headlamp in that direction, but saw nothing. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Probably just a lizard or maybe a kangaroo rat," Bella suggested. "The desert comes alive at night." We continued walking, but I found myself glancing backward more frequently. The strange sensation of being watched was beginning to creep up my spine. I tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination triggered by the unfamiliar environment. A few minutes later, we heard the scuttling sound again, this time noticeably closer and louder, suggesting something larger than a small rodent. "That sounds bigger," Michael commented, also turning to scan the darkness behind us. "Could be a javelina," Bella suggested, though her voice had lost some of its confidence. "They're common in this area." We stood still, our headlamps sweeping the surrounding terrain. The landscape was wide open, with minimal vegetation to conceal anything larger than a rabbit, yet our lights revealed nothing unusual. The sound had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. "Should we turn back?" I asked, not entirely sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Let's go a little further," Bella urged. "We've barely started, and whatever it was seems to have moved on." We resumed our hike, but the earlier carefree atmosphere had evaporated. We walked closer together, conversation diminished to occasional whispered observations. The rock piles continued to guide us reliably, their distinctive shapes visible in our headlamp beams. The moon had risen higher now, casting sharper shadows across the desert floor. The temperature had dropped further, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. We had been hiking for about 20 minutes and had covered perhaps a mile from our campsite. That's when it happened. Without warning or apparent cause, I was suddenly overcome by an overwhelming sense of terror. It wasn't the rational fear of a recognized threat. This was something primal and all-consuming, a certainty of imminent danger that bypassed conscious thought and struck directly at the most ancient part of my brain. I stopped abruptly, causing Michael to bump into me from behind. "What's wrong?" he asked, but when I turned to look at him, I saw the same expression of inexplicable horror reflected on his face. Bella had frozen a few steps ahead. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to form words. The silence around us had deepened, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. There was no wind, no insect sounds, no distant calls of nocturnal birds, nothing but our increasingly rapid breathing. And then it came, a scream that defied classification. It wasn't human, nor was it recognizable as any animal I'd ever heard. It seemed to emanate from everywhere simultaneously, a sound of such primal wrongness that my mind struggled to process it. The scream lasted for perhaps 3 seconds, but in that brief time, it communicated an unmistakable message. We were not welcome here. Time seemed to suspend itself as the scream echoed across the desert. We stood frozen, our bodies locked in place by primitive fear. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribcage, its rhythm frantic and irregular. My mouth had gone completely dry, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the chill night air. "What the hell was that?" Michael finally managed, his voice barely audible. I scanned our surroundings desperately, but my headlamp revealed nothing unusual in the immediate vicinity. The desert stretched out around us, seemingly empty, yet suddenly threatening in ways I couldn't articulate. "We need to go back," Bella whispered, the usual confidence drained from her voice. Now, no one argued. By unspoken consensus, we turned and began moving rapidly in the direction of our campsite. I don't remember consciously deciding to run, but within moments we were all sprinting, our headlamps bobbing wildly and creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow. The return journey quickly became a nightmare of confusion and escalating panic. In our haste, we struggled to locate the rock cairns that had seemed so obvious on our outward journey. When we did spot them, they appeared altered somehow, not in their position, but in their arrangement. "The rocks," I gasped between labored breaths. "They look different." Michael paused briefly to examine the nearest pile. "They've been moved," he confirmed, his voice tight with fear. "Someone or something has touched them." This realization sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. The markers hadn't been displaced by wind or animals inadvertently bumping into them. They had been deliberately altered. Someone or something had followed our trail, examining and changing the very markers we had created. We pushed on, moving as quickly as possible through the disorienting darkness. The moonlight, which had seemed so helpful earlier, now created deceptive shadows that played tricks on our senses. Several times I thought I saw movement at the periphery of my vision, only to find nothing when I turned to look directly. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, we reached a distinctive large boulder that I recognized from our outward journey. I knew we had placed a particularly large rock pile beside it as a major landmark. "The boulder," I panted, pointing ahead. "That means we're on the right track. The camp should be about half a mile beyond it." We approached the boulder cautiously. The rock pile was still there, but it had been completely dismantled and reassembled in a different configuration, the stones arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, but indecipherable. "Who could have done this?" Bella whispered, staring at the altered cairn. "Not who," Michael corrected, his voice strained. "What?" A new sound reached us then, a soft, rhythmic scraping that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. It reminded me of footsteps, but not quite human, lighter, more numerous, yet purposeful in their cadence. "Run," I urged, no longer caring about maintaining my composure. "Just run." We abandoned any pretense of careful navigation and simply fled, propelled by pure animal instinct. Somehow, whether by luck or some subconscious recognition of the terrain, we managed to stay on roughly the correct course. After a desperate sprint that left my lungs burning and legs trembling, the outline of our tent emerged from the darkness ahead. We reached our campsite and collapsed beside the tent, gasping for breath. The scraping sounds had ceased, or perhaps we had simply outrun them. For several minutes, none of us spoke, focusing instead on recovering from our flight and listening intently for any indication that we had been followed. "What do we do now?" Bella finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a good question. Despite our terror, we were still miles from any help, with no cell service and no vehicle access to our remote campsite until morning. "We should leave," I said firmly. "Pack up and hike to the road if necessary." Michael glanced at his watch. "It's nearly midnight. Hiking out now, in the dark, after what just happened?" He didn't need to finish the thought. Whatever had been out there could still be between us and safety. "Then we fortify the camp and wait until dawn," Bella suggested, visibly trying to regain her composure. We quickly implemented what protective measures we could, gathering all our gear inside the tent, ensuring our headlamps and flashlights had fresh batteries, and positioning our walking sticks within easy reach to serve as impromptu weapons if needed. I found myself wishing we had brought something more substantial for self-defense, though I couldn't articulate exactly what we might need to defend against. By 12:30 a.m., we were huddled inside the tent, sitting back-to-back in a triangle formation that allowed us to monitor all sides. Outside, the desert had fallen into an unnatural stillness that was somehow more unnerving than any overt threat. "What do you think it was?" Michael asked, breaking the tense silence. "I don't know," Bella replied. "Maybe a mountain lion. They can make some pretty disturbing sounds." But we all knew this explanation was inadequate. Mountain lions don't rearrange rock piles or produce sounds that defy natural classification. "Whatever it was," I said, "it seemed intelligent. The way it followed us, altered our markers." I couldn't bring myself to complete the thought. At approximately 1:15 a.m., the sounds began again. Subtle at first, just a faint scraping at the perimeter of our campsite. Gradually, the noises intensified and multiplied, seeming to circle our tent at a consistent distance. Occasionally, we would hear what sounded like something brushing against the ground vegetation, or small rocks being displaced. "It's stalking us," Michael whispered, clutching his walking stick so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. None of us slept. How could we? The sounds outside continued intermittently throughout the night, never close enough to suggest immediate danger, but never distant enough to allow relaxation. Twice, I thought I saw shadows moving past the tent walls, distinctly darker shapes against the moonlit backdrop of the tent fabric. At one point, around 3:30 a.m., a new sound joined the others, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the ground near our tent. It continued for approximately 15 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. "It's trying to wear us down," Bella suggested, her voice hoarse from tension. "Psychological warfare." The notion that whatever was out there might be employing deliberate tactics was perhaps the most disturbing thought of all. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern horizon around 5:45 a.m., the sounds finally ceased. We waited another 30 minutes, listening intently, before Michael cautiously unzipped the tent entrance and peered outside. "It's clear," he reported, though none of us felt particularly relieved. We emerged from the tent to find our campsite apparently undisturbed. There were no obvious footprints, no damaged equipment, no physical evidence of the night's terror, except for one detail that sent ice through my veins. Arranged in a perfect circle around our tent, at a radius of approximately 20 feet, were small piles of stones, They hadn't been there the previous evening. Each pile contained exactly 4 stones, balanced precariously one atop the other, all leaning slightly inward toward our tent. "We're leaving," I stated, and no one disagreed. We packed our gear with remarkable efficiency, spurred by the lingering fear and the mysterious stone arrangements surrounding our tent. Despite our exhaustion from the sleepless night, adrenaline kept us moving quickly. We spoke little during this process, each lost in private thoughts about what we had experienced. By 7:15 a.m., we were ready to depart. Before leaving, I felt compelled to inspect the area more thoroughly in daylight. While Michael and Bella finished securing the last items to our backpacks, I walked the perimeter of what had been our campsite. The circle of stone piles remained the only tangible evidence of our night visitors. I approached one of these structures, cautiously studying it from all angles before finally reaching out to touch it. The stones were cool and ordinary to the touch, unremarkable desert rocks, like countless others scattered across the landscape. Yet their deliberate arrangement spoke of purpose and intelligence. As I completed my circuit of the campsite, I noticed something on the ground approximately 50 yards to the north, an area of disturbed earth that hadn't been there when we arrived. Moving closer, I discovered what appeared to be a shallow depression in the desert floor, roughly oval in shape and about 4 feet in length. It resembled nothing so much as a crude imprint of a human body, as if someone had lain there for hours, watching our tent. I rejoined the others without mentioning this final discovery, fearing it might further delay our departure. We shouldered our packs and set off toward the park road where our vehicle was parked, moving at a brisk pace despite our fatigue. "I want to check something on the way back," I said as we approached the area where our night hike had begun. "The rock cairns we made yesterday, I want to see what happened to them." Bella looked reluctant, but nodded in agreement. Quickly, though. "Zili." We diverted slightly from our direct route to examine the first few markers we had placed. Just as we had discovered during our terrified flight the previous night, every single cairn had been altered. Some had been completely dismantled and rearranged into new configurations. Others had additional stones added to them. A few had been expanded into more complex structures that bore a vague but unsettling resemblance to miniature human figures. "This isn't random vandalism," Michael observed, his voice tight. "There's a pattern here, a deliberate message." "I don't want to know what it means," Bella replied, already turning back toward our exit route. We reached our vehicle shortly before 9 a.m., finding it undisturbed, small comfort given the circumstances. As we loaded our gear, Ranger Martinez drove past on her morning patrol and stopped to check on us. "Heading out early?" she inquired, noting our haggard appearances and obvious haste. "Yes," I replied simply, unwilling to elaborate. She studied our faces for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Everything okay at 9 Points Raw?" I hesitated, uncertain how to respond. How could I explain what had happened without sounding completely irrational? "We heard some unusual sounds last night," Michael offered cautiously. "Made us a bit uncomfortable." The ranger nodded slowly. "Wildlife can be disconcerting if you're not used to it." "What kind of sounds?" "Screaming," Bella said flatly, "like nothing I've ever heard before." Something flickered across Ranger Martinez's face. Recognition, concern, or perhaps resignation. 9 Points Raw has a reputation for being acoustically unusual. Sound carries strangely out there, bounces off the rock formations in unexpected ways. Her explanation was reasonable, scientific even. Yet it failed to account for the rearranged markers, the stone circle around our tent, or the overwhelming sense of malevolent presence we had experienced. "We're going to try one of the developed campgrounds for the rest of our stay," I said, changing the subject. "Good idea for first-timers," she agreed, seemingly relieved by the shift in conversation. "Rio Grande Village has some nice spots available. Stop by the visitor center on your way. They'll get you sorted. As she drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that her explanation had been too ready, too practiced, as if she had offered similar rationalizations to other shaken campers before us. We spent the remaining 2 days of our trip at Rio Grande Village, a developed campground with amenities, park staff, and most importantly, other people. The contrast with 9 Points Raw couldn't have been more stark. Here the desert seemed benign, even welcoming, its beauty unmarred by the inexplicable dread we had experienced. None of us spoke much about what had happened. During daylight hours, surrounded by the mundane activities of ordinary camping, cooking meals, reading books, taking guided hikes with rangers, it was almost possible to convince ourselves that we had overreacted to normal wilderness sounds and shadows. Almost. But each night, as darkness fell, the memories returned with surprising intensity. We stayed close to our campsite after sunset, declining invitations from neighboring campers to join their stargazing expeditions. When the wind rustled the tent fabric or distant coyotes called to one another, I found myself tensing instinctively, straining to distinguish natural sounds from whatever we had heard at 9 Points Raw. On our final morning in Big Bend, as we prepared for the drive back to Austin, Michael finally broached the subject we had been avoiding. "We should talk about what happened," he said quietly, as Bella went to return our campsite permit to the ranger station. I nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "What do you think it was?" Michael considered the question carefully before responding. "I don't know. Nothing natural, I'm pretty certain of that. But not supernatural either," I insisted, needing to establish some boundaries around the experience. "Whatever it was exists in this world, follows physical laws." "Agreed, but that doesn't mean it's something science has catalogued or explained yet." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "The desert is ancient. Humans are relatively new here. Maybe there are residents that prefer to remain undisturbed." The conversation paused as Bella returned, catching the serious expressions on our faces. "Talking about it?" she asked, settling beside us. "Trying to," I admitted. "Have you come to any conclusions?" Bella was quiet for a moment, her usual confidence temporarily absent. "Only that I never want to experience anything like that again, and that there are aspects of this world we don't understand and maybe aren't meant to." The drive back to Austin was subdued, each of us processing the experience in our own way. As civilization gradually reappeared around us, first isolated ranches, then small towns, finally the outskirts of the city, I felt a peculiar mixture of relief and loss. The desert had frightened me profoundly, yet it had also shown me something rare in our modern world: genuine mystery, an encounter with the truly unknown. 3 years have passed since our trip to Big Bend. We still go camping occasionally, but always in developed areas, never in primitive sites. Michael and I have researched desert phenomena extensively, looking for rational explanations for what we experienced: unusual acoustics, rare atmospheric conditions, undocumented wildlife. Nothing we've found fully accounts for the events of that night. Bella moved to Colorado last year. Before leaving, she confessed that she still has nightmares about the screaming sound and the circle of stones. "I think about what might have happened if we'd stayed out there just a little longer," she told me. "If we hadn't run when we did. As for me, I've developed an unlikely fascination with desert ecosystems and their inhabitants, both known and unknown. I've read anthropological accounts of indigenous beliefs about desert spirits and guardians. I've studied the psychology of fear in isolated environments. I've even corresponded with a professor of acoustic engineering about sound propagation in desert topographies. None of it has provided satisfactory answers. Perhaps there aren't any, at least none that would fit neatly into our understanding of the world. What I know with certainty is this: for one night, in the vastness of Big Bend National Park, something acknowledged our presence. Something followed our trail, examined our markers, surrounded our shelter, and let us know in no uncertain terms that we were trespassing. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still, I find myself listening, not just hearing, but truly listening to the darkness beyond my window, wondering if that inhuman scream might somehow reach all the way to my safe urban home, carried on currents of air from the ancient, watching wilderness.